All right, so this is our second to last lecture, and so this week it's all about chordate diversity, and so I'll be spending a bit of time going over several different subphylums within the phylum Chordata, and a bunch of different classes within each of those subphylums. So to review the question, what makes a chordate, we have to go through the 5 main characteristics that all chordates share. So they have a notochord, they have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, they have fringeal gill pouches, they have an endostyle, and they have a postanal tail. And so these traits are usually displayed at some point during the larval stage, which is why off on the left-hand side, you can see these larval organisms all the way from a fish to a salamander to a tortoise, all the way to a human. So a notochord is a fairly rigid structure that's found along the dorsal area, and it provides some sort of support for the dorsal hollow nerve cord. And so in the subphylum Vertebrata, this notochord is replaced by the vertebral column. So the dorsal hollow nerve cord runs down the length of the body, and it's found basically dorsal, so on top of the notochord or the vertebral column. And so in vertebrates, the front end or the anterior of this dorsal hollow nerve cord is folded, and it forms the brain. And so you have this cephalization where you have brain and all the sensory structures condensed to basically the interior of this organism, and then it's protected by the cranium, or you could also call it a skull. And so the third characteristic is fringeal gill pouches or gill slits. And so the original function of this was for filter feeding in cephalochordates or lancelets. And so those cephalochordates, they sit in the sand with their head above the water, and they have this fan that they kind of wave and collect particles, and then they pass it to their mouth, and from there excess water exits out those fringeal gill slits, whereas the food travels to the rest of the digestive system. And so in much more derived organisms, these fringeal gill pouches or gill slits form much more complex structures like jaws, or like in humans, the middle ear bones or the eustachian tubes, tonsils, or our thymus gland. And so the fourth characteristic is the endostyle, and so this was originally used as part of the filter feeding apparatus in the cephalochordates, and so that endostyle secreted some mucousy layer in order to help basically gather any sort of particles from the water. And so over time, in much more derived organisms, this endostyle forms the thyroid gland that we have today. The last characteristic is a postanal tail, and so this helps aquatic organisms push through the water, because water is a fairly dense substance. So in order to generate enough force or thrust to move forward, they have to have this fairly large surface area to propel themselves forward. And so this has been modified for terrestrial organisms. Obviously, you probably know that mammals like dogs and cats have tails, and so those postanal tails are used for balance, or, well, yeah, really just for balance. So the first 5 classes that I'll talk about are the classes Myxini, Petromyzontida, Chondrichthyes, Actinopterygii, and Sarcopterygii. And so these 5 classes actually represent 2 separate superclasses. So the first 2, Myxini and Petromyzontida, are the hagfishes and the lampreys, and those are found in the superclass Agnatha, whereas Chondrichthyes, Actinopterygii, and Sarcopterygii are found in the superclass Gnathostomata. These groups are, however, they do share a couple common characteristics. So they have a protective outer layer called entouchment, which is a form of living epidermis. So in our fish dissection, you were cutting through scales, you were cutting through basically the skin of the fish, and so that's giving it some sort of protection from external parasites, from the external environment. The fish, these groups also have a two-chambered heart, so they have a fairly simple circulatory system. They're just pumping blood through basically the ventricle and atrium into the gills, where it directly leaves the gills and goes throughout the rest of the body before it's pumped back into the heart. So they have a very simple heart. It's just a ventricle and an atrium. So these fish have what's called ectothermy, and so they don't actively control their internal temperature. They don't regulate it by any means, and so this is what you would commonly consider cold-blooded animals. And so they have to either like sun themselves, like in the cases of lizards or reptiles, which we'll talk about later on in this lecture, or they just have to kind of deal with the temperatures that's in their environment like fish do. And then for reproduction, most of these groups have external fertilization. So the female will release eggs into the water column or lay them along the substrate, and then the male will come along and fertilize them. Only in the class Chondrichthyes is there internal fertilization. So the differences between a male and female shark is that males will have what are called claspers. So these are fins that are basically shaped in order to grasp onto the female. So here's the basic or the hierarchy of our first superclass, Agnatha. And so I already mentioned that there are these two groups, these two classes within the superclass Agnatha. So we have Myxini, which are the hagfish, and then we have Petromyzontidae, which are the lampreys. So if we look at our phylogenetic tree, you can see that just beyond Urochordata and Cephalochordata, we have our very primitive chordates. And so these are craniates, meaning they do have a cranium, which is really just a very basic skull that's used to protect a brain. So these two groups, Myxini and Petromyzontidae, so these two groups are the most primitive that we'll talk about today. So they're not as primitive as Urochordata or Cephalochordata, but within Craniata, these groups are the most primitive. So class Myxini are the hagfishes, and so up here on the top, right here, we have a hagfish, and so you can see it doesn't have a lower jaw. Instead, it has these rows of teeth. And so hagfish are basically detritivores. They'll gather around like a whale fall, so a dead whale as in the ocean, and then they'll basically create a knot in their body and then tear off chunks of the flesh using these rows of teeth and really their muscular body. The class Petromyzontidae, or the lampreys, are parasitic. Well, for the most part, there are some free-living species, but they use what they call an oral disc, which is this structure right here, to clasp onto a host fish, and then it uses this rasp in the middle to slowly scrape away at any scales and basically just expose some muscles where it can start sucking out some blood and other fluids. So the characteristics of the superphylum is that there is no true jaw, so you either have this oral disc or a couple rows of teeth with no lower jaw. And another characteristic is that we have gill pouches instead of gill slits. So along the length of this body, you have these small holes that lead to basically the opening of the digestive system where fluid is going to be passing past. We don't have a vertebral column yet, so we still have a notochord in these fish, these lampreys or hagfish. And so this is fully cartilaginous. There's no ossified structures yet either. We don't have an operculum, so there's no structures covering these gill slits or these gill pouches, and we don't have any paired fins. So these are really just kind of like the snakes of the water. They don't have any extra appendages. So the next superclass that we'll talk about is the superclass Gnathostomata, and so these have a lower jaw. All right, so this is the first class within the superclass Gnathostomata. So this class, the class Chondrichthyes, are characterized by having a bony or a cartilaginous skeleton. So this class is made up of organisms like sharks, skates, and rays. So the big difference between this group and the past two groups that we covered, so Myxini and Petromyzontidae, is that the class Chondrichthyes has a lower jaw and they have paired fins. So as you probably know, sharks can be predators, so they use that lower jaw to try and catch other prey items that are swimming through the water, and they've gotten quite good at it. And so they can use their paired fins to also aid in locomotion, so they can stabilize themselves while they're swimming through the water. And so another difference between the class Chondrichthyes and, well, the other two classes of fishes that we'll talk about is that these fish don't have a true swim bladder. So in our dissection 2 weeks ago, our fish had a gas-filled sac that it used to help increase its buoyancy so it could swim through the water column easier, or much more easily. Instead, in the class Chondrichthyes, they usually have a very fatty liver, which extends throughout much of their abdomen. So they can reduce their buoyancy. Instead of having basically a gas-filled sac, they have a lipid-dense liver, which is very buoyant. All right, so this is the second class of fishes that we'll talk about. And so this is the class Actinopterygii, which roughly translates to the ray fin fishes. And so the difference between Chondrichthyes and Actinopterygii, well, there's a bunch of differences, but one of them is that these fish now have these bony structures that are used to support the fins, whereas in Chondrichthyes, the fins were generally just filled with muscle that it uses to swim throughout the water. And so these bony rays, or these ossified rays, help support that fin while this fish is moving through the water. Another difference between the class Chondrichthyes and the class Actinopterygii is that this class, Actinopterygii, has a bony skeleton, so all of it, the support for the muscle and everything else is coming from the skeleton, which is ossified, so made out of true bones. Another difference is that the muscles can attach to those paired fins, and so the paired fins then can move independently of each other. So that's why you have the pectoral fins and pelvic fins that are used to kind of maintain a certain position in the water or help aid in stability. So this group exhibits external fertilization. So a male will fertilize eggs that have been either laid on a substrate like seafloor or a stream bed, or that are floating in the water column. And so I think it's like a third or fourth difference that I've already covered. But the fourth difference between the class Chondrichthyes and the class Actinopterygii is that the class Actinopterygii has a true swim bladder. And so during our dissection 2 weeks ago, you were cutting through muscles, and if you cut too deeply, you would pop the swim bladder, which is just this air-filled sac within the body cavity of these fish. And so it uses that air-filled sac to increase its buoyancy so it can move up and down in the water column without expending a lot of energy. So not all fish within the class Actinopterygii have a swim bladder. Freshwater fish that live in very shallow streams are not going to be or won't have a developed swim bladder present because they're not going to be swimming up and down several feet. Instead, their life is basically along the bottom in the benthic area. So they don't have to develop the swim bladder, whereas other fish, like marine fish, where they're traveling tens of feet up and down the water column, they have to have this structure, or else they'll be spending lots of energy to try and move up and down in water. So this group is fairly successful. There's something like 30,000 species, and of those 30,000 species, I think 10,000 of them are freshwater. And so there's a lot of habitat worldwide for these fish. So the Earth is covered, or Earth's surface is 70% water, and of that 70%, I think it's only like 1% or 0.1% that's available in freshwater systems. And of that 0.1%, there's a ton of habitat available. So these fish have just radiated out into to fill all these niches. This is the third class of fishes that I'll go over, and so these are the Lobe Fin Fishes, and so these are much more highly derived. They have like bones inside of their fins that they can use basically to help them swim. And so it's been hypothesized that these bony fins are the predecessor to wrist bones and well, forearms. So once again, this class has a swim bladder, just like the class Actinopterygii. The only real difference is that the differences in the fins. And so the majority of these species are extinct, and really there's only a couple that are still extant, so living today. And so there's the coelacanth, which was rediscovered in the early 20th century, and then the lungfish in Africa or South America. And so the story behind the coelacanth is a pretty interesting one. There was this ichthyologist working in South Africa, and so he stopped by a fish market and he saw this species that he recognized from a fossil as being a member of Sarcopterygii, or the coelacanth, which was at that point presumed to be extinct. So he buys the fish from the fish market, and then he ships it to one of his friends in Germany, all the way from South Africa. And so this was before the time of AC or refrigerators. So his friend in Germany receives a box of decaying fish, and so he describes it as a coelacanth, and so it was rediscovered after most people thought it was extinct. And so it ends up that there's 3 or 4 species of coelacanth, and so there are these really small populations. I believe there's one off the coast, or 2 or 3 off the coast of South Africa. There's another population off the coast of Madagascar, and another population, I think, in Indonesia, I think, somewhere around there. So they have a fairly disjunct distribution, but they are fairly rare, and they haven't been recorded that often. So that's a neat group, and it's a neat group just to study on your own as well. All right, so I mentioned earlier that Sarcopterygii is hypothesized to be the predecessor to terrestrial vertebrates because it has these lobed fins. And one of the reasons why we can support that hypothesis is that we have fossil evidence from an extinct group of species, or a genus known as Tiktaalik. And so Tiktaalik was discovered from northern Canada, and it displays these primitive wrist bones. So it has these small rays inside of its fins, and it also has these much more sturdy, rigid wrist bones that it uses to prop itself up. And so if you know what a mud skipper is, it's been hypothesized that Tiktaalik was kind of like a mud skipper in the fact that it could push itself up off of substrate and kind of move around on these marshy environments. All right, so let's pose a little bit of a hypothetical question or a thought experiment. So if you wanted to change the course of vertebrate evolution, so you take millions and millions of dollars, you create a time machine, and you go back in time to the late Devonian period, so roughly 370 some million years ago, to where Tiktaalik was still living, and you went to northern Canada where this transitory species was found, and you walk around these marshes and you just punt these puppies back into the primordial soup in order to prevent them from being terrestrial. And so the question is, would there still be terrestrial vertebrates after that? And so the answer is, yeah, there probably would be. So even though Tiktaalik is what we call a transitory species, so it displays characteristics that are kind of in between two very well-defined groups, it wasn't the only transitory species that we know of. So while Tiktaalik is fairly unique, it's not the only one that we know that was able to basically do a very primitive push-up and prop its body up above a substrate and then move around like that. So Tiktaalik is really well known because it was the first fossil evidence that basically linked aquatic life to terrestrial vertebrates. But there are tons of other groups that we know of now, like Pandreichthyes, Euthenopteran, Sauropterus, that were fully capable of, like I said, a very primitive push-up, and they probably lived in these marshy environments where they had both a terrestrial and an aquatic stage. And so the answer is you wouldn't really be changing much in terms of vertebrate evolution. I mean, some things would be different, so the predecessors directly after Tiktaalik probably wouldn't be the same, but there would still be terrestrial vertebrate life afterwards. So hopefully you may have noticed that two of the groups, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, looked a lot like salamanders or hellbenders, and that's because those two groups are the true predecessors to the salamanders, the frogs, and the toads that we have today. And so those groups are in the class Amphibia. And so this group is characterized by having a terrestrial life stage, but they still rely upon water very heavily. So they have 4 defined limbs. So as you look at that hellbender, you can see it has 4 legs. Hopefully you know that a frog has 4 legs as well, so it uses those legs to move around on the earth. So once again, this group is ectothermic. They don't control or actively regulate their body temperature, and so they have to rely on either the sun or another source of heat in order to increase their body temperature when it's cold out. Another difference between the class Amphibia and the other classes that we talked about today is that this group is fully capable of cutaneous respiration. So it's passing oxygen through its skin directly into the body, into the circulatory system. So a lot of aquatic salamanders will have these gills or have these really wrinkly bodies so that they can increase surface area, draw a lot of oxygen from the water, pass CO2 out of their body, and oxygen into their body so that they can respire very efficiently. And so another thing that the class Amphibia has in common is that they all rely, for the most part, on external fertilization. So if you go to a vernal pool around springtime, you'll see all these egg masses that are floating in the water, And so those are fertilized eggs that are waiting basically to hatch. So these amphibians still rely fairly heavily on an aquatic environment. So they rely on that aquatic environment to lay their eggs because their eggs don't have a protective area. And so if you take like a frog egg and you put it on land, it'll dry out really quickly. So these amphibians are very dependent on the presence of water. So this is one of the many reasons why amphibians are in decline around the world, is because they're so attached to this aquatic stage or this aquatic habitat, where any sorts of anthropogenic impacts like sedimentation, acid mine drainage, or anything has a really detrimental effect on these groups. So they can't lay their eggs on land. They have no other option. So when they encounter pollutants, it affects them at a couple different stages. So it's going to be affecting either fertilized eggs or larval stages, which we call tadpoles. So the only stage it really doesn't affect them at is the adults, which are, for the most part, either terrestrial or sometimes can be fully aquatic, like in hellbenders. So the next group of vertebrates that are terrestrial vertebrates is the class Reptilia, and so these are the reptiles. And this is the first truly terrestrial group. The amphibians from the last couple slides, they still rely on an aquatic environment, but these reptiles, they don't have to rely on an aquatic environment anymore because they have what's called an amniotic egg. And so an amniotic egg has a very hard outer covering that prevents that egg from drying out. It also gives it a little bit of protection from like predators or parasites. So this is a major development in terrestrial evolution. It allows for basically life, or terrestrial vertebrate life, to take a step away from an aquatic habitat. And so you can find reptiles in pretty much all environments, even in deserts where it may rain once or twice a year. So reptiles have been extremely successful, which is kind of evidenced by dinosaurs, several hundred million years ago, until their demise roughly 65 million years ago with the KT event. And so this is another very successful group. I forget how many species there are in total, but I think it's something like 30,000, 40,000 described species of reptiles. So most of these species have a 3-chambered heart, but in alligators and crocodiles, they have a 4-chambered heart. So they have an atrium, or left and right atrium, and a left and right ventricle, kind of like mammals do. And so another major difference between the class Reptilia and the class Amphibia is that the class Reptilia has these keratinized scales that cover the length of its body and help prevent that organism basically from drying out. So keratin is the same protein that makes up our fingernails and our hair, and it's fairly hydrophobic. So it's basically keeping water out, and it's also keeping water inside the body. So it has this function of basically keeping this reptile from desiccating or drying out. Another major step or difference between the class Amphibia and the class Reptilia is that we now have internal fertilization, but external development. So a male will fertilize a female, and then the female will lay the eggs somewhere else. So we have another transitory species. So we now have a fossil that represents the transition from a reptile to a flying bird. And so this group is called Archaeopteryx. And so this group, Archaeopteryx, is also called Urvogel, which is a German name, which was provided to it basically because this specimen, the one that you see in the picture, was discovered in Germany, and then it's been displayed in Berlin ever since. So you can definitively see feathers. So this group is the oldest known relative of birds, and it was fully capable of flying. So that brings us to flight. So flight's evolved something like 4 times in evolutionary history. So it began with the pterosaurs, so the flying dinosaurs. It's evolved in birds, in insects, and then in mammals with bats. And so there's a couple different hypotheses for how flight evolved. The first of which is the Arboreal Hypothesis, and this basically states that reptiles or very primitive dinosaurs, or primitive birds, were living in trees, and so as they were jumping around on the trees, those that had some ability to glide eventually tried to control that glide, and those that were better able to control that glide further evolved into what we consider active flight, so moving their wings and basically generating lift. The other hypothesis is the Cursorial Hypothesis, and so this basically states that there was these ground-running bipeds like velociraptors or Tyrannosaurus rexes that were running along the ground, and they were jumping. Those that were jumping higher were basically experiencing an intermediate gliding stage, and so from there they were able to actively basically generate lift, and then from there using they would generate true flight. And so the Cursorial Hypothesis is much more supported than the Arboreal Hypothesis. So that brings us to the class Aves, and so these are the birds. This is one of the several groups that radiated from the reptilian root. And so this group is characterized by having a layer of dead epidermis that is similar to scales. So the development of feathers is used for flight, but it can also be used for thermoregulation. So if you've ever had like a down pillow or a down blanket, it's extremely warm because these feathers trap in lots of heat and keep that bird warm until it was plucked and put into your pillow. Another characteristic of the class Aves is that it has a beak, but it doesn't have any teeth. So if you've ever raised chickens, you know that they like to peck things. If you've ever had a parrot, it's probably a good thing that they don't have teeth. Another characteristic of class Aves is that they have a very lightweight skeleton, and they have what are called pneumatic bones. And so these bones are hollow, which helps basically decrease the weight of that skeleton. And the whole purpose of this is to decrease the weight, which decreases the effort or the energy required to get that bird off the ground or out of the nest or out of a tree and actively fly. So not all birds fly, as you probably should know with like a kiwi. So this is a cool video. It's a little dated, it's from 2016, but it shows a kiwi running around, and he or she is fairly excited because their caretaker left extra food in their pen. So they are fairly personable. Maybe he's a little too excited since he does fall over, but this is another neat group, and it's a fairly diverse group. I forget how many species of birds there are in total, but I think it's something like 10,000 species. So each one of these species still has amniotic eggs, so they lay an egg after internal fertilization. They have external development. And so once again, that amniotic egg is protecting this egg from desiccation. It's giving this bird a further step away from its aquatic vertebrate predecessors. So the big difference between reptiles and aves, and well, the other groups that we'll talk about, like mammals, is that they're endothermic, so they can actively regulate their internal body temperature. So they have those feathers that they can trap air, but they can also create body heat from their their body metabolism, and then they maintain that temperature by either hair or feathers or structures like that. So I mentioned sexual selection, was it last week when we had behavior lab, but this is really exaggerated in some species of birds. So in the male peacock, they have these very ornate plumes or feathers that it uses to try and attract a female peacock. But if the feathers get too large, it can no longer run away from predators. It can no longer escape. So there's this this fine line that this bird is trying, or this male is walking along, is trying to have large enough feathers to attract a female, as well as small enough feathers where it's not going to be eaten. And so these groups have some fairly unique behaviors designed to attracting mates. And so I gave the example of the superb bird of paradise last week, where it does this really ornate dance. Sir David Attenborough did a great job narrating one of the superb birds of paradise mating dance, which I highly recommend you all watch. So I put a link, I don't know if you can click on it, but put a link right there for it. And so this brings us to the last group of vertebrates. So this is the class Mammalia. We are in the class Mammalia. So this is characterized by having hair, by having mammary glands, as well as a four-chambered heart. And so mammary glands are these, or are hypothesized as being these old sweat glands that have now been modified to produce milk for their young. It's kind of obvious what hair is. So hair's basically a thermoregulatory adaptation. So it traps heat against the body. In some cases, it's fairly modified. So like in polar bears, their hair is hollow, so it can trap air within its hair and then basically warm its body that way. So mammals are a fairly non-diverse group of organisms. I mean, they're extremely successful. I mean, think about humans, but they're not very diverse. There's only something like 6,500 known species of mammals in the world, so not very diverse at all, especially when you consider something like insects, where there's 600,000 described species. So these mammals are broken up into three distinct orders, or extant orders, so still living orders. And so these are the monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians. So the monotremes are from the order Monotremata, and this is the most primitive group of mammals that we know of. So these mammals still have a egg-laying stage, so they have internal fertilization, but then external development. So these are very closely related to like the reptiles, so that they lay eggs rather than bear live young. And so these groups of monotremes are only found in Australia and I believe Papua New Guinea. So they're not very diverse at all, and they're fairly restricted to a couple islands. The other group of mammals, or the second order of mammals, is the order of marsupials. And so these are pouched mammals. So once again, you have internal fertilization, but you have external development. And so I don't know if you all listen to podcasts, but there's a really good podcast called Ologies by Ali Ward, and she invites all these different scientists representing different ologies, so like biology, ecology, stuff like that. And she had a scientist who was studying Tasmanian devils, and during that podcast, she mentioned that there's something like 20 or 30, well, how would you say it, children that are produced at a single time, and then they all kind of scramble to try and find the nipple. Those that don't find the nipple are then eaten by the mother. So Tasmanian devils really have a really rough life right from the very beginning. But these marsupials include other mammals like possums, which is the only North American species of marsupials, kangaroos, wallabies, stuff like that. So the last group of mammals that we'll talk about, well, the last major group at least, is the order Eutherian. So Eutherians are placental mammals, so they have internal fertilization and internal development, and then the mother of that developing individual will pass nutrients to the developing offspring through the placenta. And so that placenta is carrying nutrients and oxygen through these capillary beds directly to that developing offspring. So that is chordate evolution in 43 minutes. There are a lot of very interesting groups that we weren't able to cover just because of time limitations, and it's difficult to cover several 100,000 different species in less than an hour's time. So this week's lab is the pig dissection, or we will be starting the pig dissection. So you all have some hands-on experience with a mammal.